We here at NCTV continue our series on the history of U.S. presidents. This week, we learn about the United States' 11th president and the second of 3 Tennessee presidents, President James K. Polk.
He was our 11th president, and interestingly enough, at the time he was elected, he was our youngest president. But he starts off being born in North Carolina, Mecklenburg County, which is where a lot of people who settled in Tennessee were from. They were all neighbors or something. So he was born in 1795, the first of 10 children. His father was a very successful farmer, businessman, and quite wealthy for that day and time. Did have a number of slaves. But the family moved to Tennessee in 1806 and settled on the Duck River. James would have been about 11 years old at that time. So he grew up and was educated locally, which again was unique because of his family status that he got an education. In 1816, he went back to North Carolina to go to college at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Now, it was brand new. There were 80 students in the whole university at that time. His roommate, interestingly enough, was a man named William Moseley, who would later on become the first governor of Florida. Anyway, interesting connection there. So he graduates, comes back to Tennessee and studies for the law. Now back then, law schools didn't exist. You would read for the law. And to read for the law meant you went to a lawyer's business and you read his law books and he'd advise you. And then when you got well enough reading, and I guess you had read, then you'd take the bar exam. So he studies under Felix Grundy, who was perhaps Nashville's most famous lawyer. So he studies for the law and passes the bar exam. His very first case was defending his own father in a charge of public fighting. He won that case and got his father off with a fine of $1. So that's an interesting story there. Now in the meantime, he had met Sarah Childress, who would later become his wife. She was a little bit younger than him, so they were friends. But Andrew Jackson was a close friend of both the Polk family and the Childress family, and this is a quote. Andrew Jackson said to James K. Polk, he said, "Sarah is wealthy, pretty, ambitious, and intelligent. You need to marry that girl." And so they do marry. Now, before they marry, a year before they marry, he runs for the Tennessee House of Representatives. Now, James K. Polk, they say that if you sat down and talked with him, it was kind of boring. But on the stump, on the political stump, he was an excellent orator. He was great at speaking, public speaking, and that was a real gift for him. And so, and back then, to explain what a stump was, if you went from one town to another to speak publicly, there was always a tree stump somewhere that you could stand on. I mean, it's like we're going to save that tree stump, and that's where people would give speeches. We still talk about stump speaking, or going on the stump when you're running for politics. So he would stand on the stump in these small towns, and he ran, of course, for his area. And he was so well at speaking, they called him the Napoleon of the stump, which I think is funny. So he won that election in 1823, and then the next year he marries her. She was 20, he was 28. She was well educated for that time, from a wealthy family, of course, and a better education than most women would have had at that time. She was his help all the way through the time he was president, all of his politics. She advised him. He took a great interest in what her opinion was, and she was a good host when he was president of the United States. So they marry. Then he goes to Washington and serves in the state representatives. And then in 1825, he runs for the United States House of Representatives and is elected. Again, does a good job of speaking. He goes to Washington. He boards in the same boarding house as Sam Houston. Of course, Sam Houston, Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, we're talking about birds of a feather there. So he does well there. Is very well liked and is reelected several times. Very close to Andrew Jackson and supports Andrew Jackson just about everything Andrew Jackson does. So much so that he gets a second nickname. He was the Napoleon of the stump, and now he's Young Hickory. Of course, Andrew Jackson was Old Hickory, and so that was in reference to that. In 1835, he becomes Speaker of the House of Representatives. Now, that's quite an accomplishment. Even today, if you're the Speaker of the House of Representatives, some people see that as a step to higher office, because you know what present House of Representatives Speaker is thinking, in the back of his head. One day I might be President of the United States. Well, this may be where he got the idea, but it was certainly a big step in his favor. But after a year or so, he quits the House of Representatives and comes back to Tennessee and runs for governor. And he was elected in 1839. He was our state's first college-educated governor. So, and that's probably a reason why he's been reelected so many times House of Representatives and did such a good job speaking. He was well educated and so on. So anyway, oddly enough though, the House of Representatives in Tennessee had changed its politics over the years, and he, even though he was elected by popular vote, he did not get along with the House of Representatives and did not get much accomplished as governor. In fact, when he ran for re-election, he lost. He ran for election again, lost a second time. Now, all this is happening though on the national level. His name is still very prominent because he had again been in the House of Representatives for a long time and had been Speaker of the House of Representatives. Still a good friend of Andrew Jackson. So there's an election coming up for president. He's a Democrat. Van Buren is a Democrat. So what he wants Van Buren's planning on running. He wants to be Van Buren's vice president. So the nomination committee convention is coming up, and Polk plans to not be at the convention. Instead, he's going to have people there. He does have people there. He's not stupid. He has people there, and keep his name in play for vice president. But here's a problem. Texas wants to join the Union. Texas is its own independent country because it's the war with Mexico and Texas. The problem is that Texas is a slave state. Now, of course, that's one reason it broke from Mexico. Is Mexico was against slavery, had outlawed slavery, and then when the Texans moved there, they wanted slaves. One reason they wanted slaves was because already slaves were escaping to the north, to, of course, where there was no slavery. If Texas had joined the Union as a non-slave state, then slaves would have fled there. It was a lot closer and easier to get to Texas, just cross the Mississippi River. And so Texas, people were saying, no, you can't let Texas in the Union because that'll make an escape place for slaves, because we won't let it in if it's a slave state. So there was a controversy. Now, two other people were running for president, Van Buren, of course, and Henry Clay. So both of them, they're trying to play the political game. They say, you know what? Publicly now, they issued a statement that they would not support Texas becoming a state. They would not support that because it would throw things off. Kansas had the same problem when Kansas wanted to become a state. But Polk is for it. Polk believes in manifest destiny, the belief that the United States should own everything from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. He thinks we should have Texas. And of course, he's also a slaveholder himself. He's been brought up with slaves. And even though he does not make it real publicly known his slave dealing, he has several plantations and he has had slaves. And he sells and barters slaves. He tends to keep families together, but not necessarily on his personal slave record. So Andrew Jackson says, you know what you need to do? You need to make that loud. You need to make that a notice. People need to know that you're for Texas joining the Union. So he comes out and says, I'm for Texas joining the Union. Well, the people in the South all of a sudden changed their allegiance from Van Buren to Polk. So the convention comes up. Van Buren doesn't get the nomination on the first vote. And so I don't know how many votes they go through. They can't find anyone that everyone likes. And so Polk's people were in there and say, well, just put Polk up there. Now, he was not necessarily planning that, but he takes it. So he gets the nomination. Now, we call that a dark horse candidate. He is our nation's first dark horse candidate. Now, a dark horse is a racing term, and it comes from the basic fact this: you're at a horse race, and you're betting on this horse to win or that horse to win. All of a sudden, the horse comes out of the dark and wins. Like, where did he come from? That's what a dark horse candidate is. It's someone you're not expecting, and all of a sudden their name is pulled out, and they win. I think Abraham Lincoln was considered a dark horse candidate. He was not planning on running, and they couldn't find anyone. They pulled his name out. So he was our first dark horse candidate. So he accepts the nomination and is elected. Now, interestingly enough, in that election, of course, the South votes for him strongly. He did not win the state of Tennessee. He lost it by 123 votes. Very, very close. Nationwide, it was a close election. He won by only 40,000 votes out of 2.6 million votes cast. So, our 11th president, at the time, the youngest elected president, he was age 50. Now, when you group presidents today, and I do this all the time, our most successful presidents, people have a list of what they think. Most people consider him a forgotten president. He's not a name that people recall. I mean, we think Teddy Roosevelt and, of course, FDR, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan. They're names we throw about. But he's usually not on that list. But on the list of successful presidents, he's often number one or number two, because of what he did. Here's what he did. Texas joins the Union through the Mexican War, which, of course, Polk is in favor of. So the Mexican War is fought while he's president. As a result of that, and the Treaty of Hidalgo afterwards, we not only get Texas, we get Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California. And then he oversees the purchase of the Oregon Territory from England, which gives us Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. He doubled the size of our country in one term. He also established the Department of the Interior. So his goals were accomplished. Now, he decides not to run a second time. And he announced, he said, I'm only going to run one time. I'm not really sure why he did that. Of course, the precedent of running 2 terms is kind of a tradition. There was no limit on how many times you could run. So he only runs 1 term, and he's true to his word. He does not run a second time. Succeeding him is Zachary Taylor, who he was not particularly fond of. His vice president was named Dallas, and of course that's whom Dallas, Texas is named for. So he doesn't run again, and at that time, the inauguration was in early March, not like it is, it's January, isn't it, January? And so he stays around for the inauguration, and even though he wasn't particularly fond of Taylor, he's accommodating to him and all that. So as soon as the election is over and he's no longer president, he and his wife tour the South. It's kind of like a victory tour. And everywhere he goes, people clap in the South, not in the North so much. In the South, he's very well received. The only problem was it was very tiring on him. And there were threats of cholera everywhere he went. Now back then, people didn't know what caused cholera. Well, you know, it has to do with dirty drinking water. Drinking water is gotten from wells close to septic tanks and so on, sewers and outhouses. And in particular, on one steamboat they were on, a fellow passenger fell dead of cholera. So they're very careful to try to keep him away from it. Nonetheless, when he finally gets back to Nashville, he's tired, he falls sick, and he dies. And we presume it's cholera. They say he died of cholera. We can't prove that now. Now, that brings the next interesting point. James K. Polk was buried 3 times. The first time he was buried outside the town limits because he died of cholera, they thought. And not knowing what caused cholera, if you died of cholera, it's like, well, we're not going to put you close to the family house here. We're going to bury you way off, because they didn't know what caused cholera. And they didn't want anyone associating with that grave and that site. So he's buried in the Old City Cemetery, which at that time was at the edge of town, so nowhere near people. Then, later, he's moved to the grounds of his family home, his nice home in Nashville, which actually I think had been the home of Felix Grundy. He and his wife bought it and restored it. And they have a small cemetery in the backyard, and he's buried there. Now, he was had the shortest retirement of any American president, because he died 3 months after his term was over. His wife, however, lived to be 87. She had another 42 years. She had the longest widowhood of any American president's wife. She's buried behind the house as well. But not long after her death, and they had no children. They raised a couple of nephews and nieces and people like that they took care of, but they didn't actually have any children of their own, of course, or even raise any of those for very long. But the house goes to a family member. One of her nieces married a man named Brown, who also becomes governor of Tennessee. But here's the second part of the story. So he's moved once. To the second time, that house is torn down, and he and his wife then are reinterred on the Capitol grounds. So he was buried 3 times. She was buried twice. And like I say, today he is considered one of our most successful presidents because of what he did to the size of our nation. Just goes to show, you know, one person can make all the difference in the world.
You can learn more about President Polk at his home in Columbia, Tennessee. It's open Monday through Saturday from 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. and on Sunday from 1 p.m. until 5 p.m. Next week, we'll find out interesting facts about our 12th president, Zachary Taylor. Reporting from Hartsville, Barry Hyatt, NCTV.